All right, guys, welcome. We're going to talk about introduction to React and why this library is kind of taken over the development terrain at this in 2020 and 2019, the past few years, right? I mean, we'll talk about why it is. We're going to talk a little bit about we're going to talk a little bit about let's see here what's on React history today. We're going to talk about React history. All right, so we're going to talk about some of the timelines here. So some of the timelines of React, if you don't know, it was created by Facebook, used on Instagram currently. In 2012, it was put on Instagram. Then it was open source in 2013, embraced by a number of large companies. And then 2015, React Native was released, and then 2016, React 15 was released with some very good, important features. It's been around for a while. A lot of large companies now utilize React. So we got Facebook, Instagram, of course, a whole bunch of other ones. Netflix to name one. GitHub, PayPal, these different ones, right? I mean, but so Airbnb, so it's pretty well used and proven. It's pretty mature, so we can kind of trust it. So Facebook and React, they're pretty tightly bound. I guess Zuckerberg one day said, Google's doing their own framework, we got to do ours too, right? And you can see actually they're into quite a bit of stuff, which you might not know and might be a little surprised about. There's two big players right now in front end frameworks for JavaScript. There's Google, which has Angular, and there's Facebook, which has React. And there's a little bit of a war there between the two. At one time, Angular was the top dog, but in recent years, I think React has pulled away in the lead quite a bit, to be honest. I really didn't understand it until really recently when I really started using React. So I was totally pro Angular. So, anyhow, um, so Facebook used it internally for 2 years before making it open source. Initially, it was dismissed because React didn't follow proper practices. And what this means is, and I truly also had an opinion that I didn't really like it because what it does is it mixes markup and logic in the same file. And what that means is traditionally, and we'll get to that in a second, traditionally, when you're working in web development, the view is the view. The view is separate. So the view is separation of concerns. You have that markup, that view, that HTML view. You can go and give that to a designer, and you're fine. And you can work in code behind. They would call code behind, where you do where the programmer or developer do all the logic and the business logic and all that stuff. And you don't really need to worry about the presentation, I guess, so much, right? So here in React, and we'll see in a bit, they mix the presentation with the logic, and it takes a little to get used to, but once you get used to it, it's not bad. But initially, it was dismissed. So, but people started to get used to it as time went on. It was more component centric, component based, and how they started looking at things, a different way of looking at things, but it actually works really well. So again, it's stable, 5 years to active deployment, heavily usage. Facebook is very deeply committed to React. They have a whole staff, so they're very passionate about keeping this library around. So talk about the React architecture. So they do some very interesting things, and it also will maybe shed some light on why it is actually very popular. Um, let's just quickly look at the architecture here. So we have this. We have something called JSX that we'll get to. Let me use my laser pointer here because I got it. So we have this JSX file. So when you look at the JSX file, what that is it's looks like HTML, but it's really not. It's syntactic sugar again around how React compiles HTML elements. So it's basically a mixture of HTML and JavaScript. And what happens is React will transform this JSX down into pure JavaScript files and then to the React library runtime. So this is how those pages get transpiled down to the React runtime. So what happens that's very interesting here, and this is one of the main features that it took me a while to really get right in terms of why it would be such a big improvement is if you look at this DOM right here, and that stands for the document object model. that's normally in the browser. And basically, what happens is when you have a markup, say HTML markup, you have a body tag, you have a matching body tag close, you have some children tags, right? Like maybe you maybe have a div tag, some type of container, and a button, and a span, all these things. What happens is the browser, it creates this DOM tree, this element tree, right? And it traverses this node. So if you make a change here, say there's like a little clock or timer here, every time it ticks, it tears down this entire tree just to update that tick, right? So it's very slow and inefficient, and it basically you will see those reloads, right? And it can cause delays in the page. So what React did, and we'll get to it again, is they have something called a virtual DOM. And basically what it means is, maybe I'm getting a little bit too far into it, but in a nutshell, what it does, before we get into it, is it'll track it'll track the changes on those tree nodes, and it has something in memory. And basically what it does is it'll at the end of the day it'll only update one of those tree nodes, and then it'll basically take that copy and send that to the browser, if that makes any sense. So we'll get into all of that, but the point is it doesn't refresh the whole page of the whole tree. It only updates what it needs to, and that's what makes it really fast. And that's in a nutshell. Uh, so some of the benefits is it's very flexible, and I proved this. So you learn it once, and you can write applications just about anywhere. So I learned this myself recently because I again pro Angular, and I had to take an Angular 2 app and mount it into a .NET web forms, and basically it's not meant for that. It's meant to be a single page application. And it took me a while. It took me like I don't want to say a week, but it took me like 4 or 5 days to get it working properly. And then I did the same kind of thing with React later on, after all that had died down. I did it on my own in less than a day. Because why? Because it's not a framework, it's a library. And you can easily insert it into the markup as you could jQuery without having to worry about mounting and things like that. So it's very flexible, and it has a lot fewer opinions. And when we mean it's more flexible, meaning that it only does one thing specifically, and that's it. And you basically pick and choose your own adventure after that, meaning any extra tools you may need, you pull into it when you need it. Whereas a framework like Angular makes all those decisions for you, and all the tools are in the box, and they give you the box, and you just say thank you very much. And I liked that for a while, until I realized the flexibility of it. So React is a library, not a framework. That is like the most important thing to take away from this. That's the difference. It's not a framework. It's a library. And people come to you and say, "Do you know JavaScript frameworks?" Yeah, I know React, but it's a library. Okay, it's not meant to be a framework. It has a very specific uh, uh, purpose, and we'll get to that in a second. So on the left there, this is an older trend, 2018, 60K job offers, and I didn't believe it, and I didn't understand why. So it's probably less now, because I started looking for a job recently, and I remember seeing I didn't see too many Angular jobs out there. I mean, I saw them, but not as many. And I have more experience in Angular than I do React. So when I started seeing everything and the new postings, everybody was looking for React, and I was like, I gotta, well, fortunately enough, I'm in a team now that does React, so I'm gonna be fine. But I couldn't believe it. I hadn't looked in 2 years, and the change in the whole marketplace was extremely surprising, to be honest. And it probably gets to the point of why it's being implemented everywhere, and we'll talk about that. So the ecosystem has grown in popularity, and there's a reason why for that. So again, to build web applications, and there's also a whole bunch of other of these things that they've got into, Facebook especially, static sites using Gatsby and GraphQL. So what GraphQL is, and again, Facebook kind of took a different paradigm for RESTful APIs, and they did something called GraphQL. And what that is in a nutshell, again, is it's a way to query RESTful APIs. That's incredible, right? If you really think about that, normally you rely on the REST endpoints, and they're basically really, they're really, they really are very well defined, like get, customer, get customer by ID, get customers some other type of, and country, or, now get country. So sometimes you got to do a lot of combining. Sometimes you got to wait for the backend team to give you an endpoint with, and they have to go query the database, wrap it all up, give it back to you. So what GraphQL does is it allows UI developers not to worry about the backend team. They can actually make their own queries and send the queries to the API layer, and they can write. So basically, they are creating their own endpoint. They're creating their own RESTful services by querying. It's crazy. Anyways, it's quite interesting. Anyways, Facebook did that as well. Um, Going back to React, mobile native devices using React Native, desktop applications using Electron. So they have a desktop version using, and we'll tell you why it's so flexible again. Server side renderings using Next.js. So what happens is sometimes single page applications, in a nutshell again, there's a big problem with the page loading. The first initial load takes a long time to reload, and some people don't like that load. So what they were really smart with Next.js is they could serve some pieces of that from the server lightning fast, and that's the reason why they would do that. Maybe you need to load the header and the footer from the server quickly, and then the content always changes. Maybe something like that. And then really cool thing, very cool VR rendering. So for Oculus Rift or these VR glasses, they have a React 360 that you could use. So and we'll get to understand why you can do all this stuff uh, that probably Angular cannot do, to be honest. So the this is the main point. Why it's so versatile. It's versatile because the renderer is separate from React itself. And what that means is you can go and build a bunch of functional components and build all your logic. And you can swap out the piece that renders to the browser can be swapped out. So you can keep all your logic, and you can say, I'm going to the web, I'm going to swap out this renderer for the web. Now I'm going to the desktop, I'm going to swap out that render for like Electron. Or you could, I've even seen this, right? You could actually take your application and then put another lens on it called a renderer, and you could put the React VR renderer, and all of a sudden, as long as you use the React VR API, you can basically, you can look at your application with the, those VR goggles. It's very crazy, actually. It's very interesting. So for web apps, you use React DOM to render HTML components. For React Native, you used React Native for the native friendly code. VR apps use React VR, uh, formerly called 360, but it's called React VR for rendering components in virtual reality. Right? If you had something like a grid, you could look left and right, and it would have a little bit of 3D. And maybe instead of interacting like you would with click and mouse, maybe you look at a certain hotspot, and that's how you transition to the next page. It's very interesting. There's a lot of other renderers there, but these are the main ones we mentioned here. All right, so easy to learn API. So easy to learn API. Let me get rid of this laser. React. So it's very simple to learn. There's few concepts because truly what React is, and if you look at the website, it'll make a statement. It is for uh, component-based UI library. That's all it's supposed to do. It's just supposed to render the UI. That's all, and it's based on components. Now we talked about having fewer opinions because it doesn't give you much. It just serves that purpose. If you want to go outside of that purpose, then you need to look externally to pull other things in, right? So that's why it's very good at what it does. It does something, it does it well, and that's what they focus on, right? So the concept is a function. If we've been learning JavaScript functions, it's pounding in our head. So the difference is it's a function that has a mix of HTML, which is called JSX, right? And if you quickly look at the function on the right, the syntactic sugar here. So if you have our constant, we have something called props, which we'll get into. It's a function, but it returns a JSX div element. Again, that's our syntactic sugar because React will transpile it down to something that looks like this. React create element. That's what this tag will transpile down to. And if you ever see it using a compiler called Babel, if you have a ton of HTML, you'll see JSX. Sorry, you'll see a lot of JavaScript using React create element, and it's actually quite quite a bit of code. You don't want to be writing that. You could. It's not wrong to do it, but the JSX is a lot easier. So again, we talked about how fast it is, and it's super fast. It's very fast. The DOM, as we said, is slow. So the team realized that it's very expensive to change all those node trees every time we're getting changes, right? So we need to enhance performance. There's a way of enhancing it. So Angular does something called the shadow DOM, right? But they do things a little bit differently. They call it the virtual DOM. And when they mean virtual DOM, it's like a copy in memory, a copy of memory of the DOM. So when you change data behind the scenes, React is intelligently figuring out the most efficient way to update the DOM. So they do something called tree reconciliation. They reconcile the changes of that DOM tree. They reconcile it, and then basically they take that copy, that virtual DOM, with just the changes that they need, and then they basically not overwrite it, but they basically make those changes in the real DOM without doing the whole tear down and redraw of the whole page elements, right? Because previously, like it says, the other pages would redraw the whole page when a minor changes recurred, but with React, you only update the node where the minor change has occurred. If that makes any sense. If it way down in the tree, maybe some little tiny uh, label has been updated, then we're just going to update that little node, and that's all. So one thing to note is React DOM and React is very small. It's only 35K when zipped up and minified. That is the JavaScript files. Preact, there's another versions of all this stuff. They had one called Preact and Inferno and all these things. They're only 3K. Extremely small libraries. If you look at React, it's a beast. Sorry, Angular is a beast compared to this, right? It's a lot. It's a lot of code. All right, so we talked about Angular a lot, and if you don't have any context about Angular, then we're just making a little comparison. So one-way versus two-way binding. So in Angular, we have this concept of two-way binding, all right? And we keep it in sync, and this shows interpolation, but there is a concept called banana in a box that basically it does this two-way binding where you have a property and the code behind it. When you type when you type into the text box, it automatically updates and syncs the model behind. However, in React, there's a bit more code to it, and again, this takes a little bit to get used to. It's more explicit and it's very controlled. If you want to do something like that, you have to handle it in a little bit more different way. And that it's a bit of a learning curve to be honest, because each component has state, and you have the controls are handled by the DOM, and you have to overwrite it, and you have to add like event handlers and state, and it gets a little confusing to be honest. But later on, they introduced a concept called hooks that made this a little bit more user friendly. So again, React is JavaScript focused. So if you're good at JavaScript, you're going to be good at React because it's a lot of JavaScript. No other concepts to learn. Like with Angular and Vue, they power up the HTML. And what we mean is they give there's their own directive markups in the HTML that if you look at the page source, you'll see all these new tags like ngIf for if statement, ng-for, and then the click is like has to be have have parentheses or bracket parentheses around it. Vue. So we talk about the third step cousin here. Like there's Angular and there's React. There's another one called Vue.js. It's basically trying to take the best of both. But they have their own syntax. Everything's V dash, right? So you have to figure out their own syntax, V dash. So with React, you're just using JavaScript if and or and the logical operators. You're using the map function from ES6. You're using all that stuff you already know. So it's nothing new. You just have to know how to use it. So the one change is that sometimes in the JSX you need to be very careful with some things as on click and class name and things like that. They have to be camel cased. It's just how the markup is. But aside from that, it's just all JavaScript. Now this is a thing where this is the big deal that people had a problem with. So it went against the traditional ways of separating technologies. So, and this is the way I grew up in a sense. Like on the left side, this is the way I've learned it for 10 years, right? Or more. Like it's like you have JavaScript in the back end, or you have, let's just say front end, right? You have JavaScript, CSS, and your HTML, and they're all separate. The markup is not mixed with the JavaScript code. The JavaScript, even with jQuery, you attach selectors to the HTML and you modify it. But here it's a mixture of each. And the way they separate it from a different point of view is they say, okay, here's a date picker or a button component, and it contains in that file everything you need. It contains a JavaScript, CSS, and HTML all in one sliver, in one vertical. And it's just a very different way of looking at things, and it just takes a while to get used to it. But once you get used to it, you can kind of see the beauty of it in a sense, right? One component is very contained and it has its own concern. Whereas you would have a ton of HTML, a ton of CSS all over the place, right? So it is a very good point of view once you get used to it, to be honest. But you got to remember, React is all about components, and you think about nested components. When you look at an application, you have to envision that each piece of the application is a component and may have a child component and all these things. Like if you have a Facebook, you have the feed, you have a like button, you have the status update, the navigation bar, all those kind of things. In Twitter, you have the tweets with the, all those kind of things. They can all be reusable components that, because smaller components can make up bigger components. That Facebook feed you have could be basically made up of many different child components, which also have their own children components to them. So one thing to notice is, because it's such a small library, and this is the power of it, because you can insert that React library in any page and have it powered up in any page, and just start to take that component approach, you can migrate a site. And this is how Facebook itself migrated its way from a PHP site to a React site, is because they stuck React in some of these PHP pages and said, okay, let's just focus on converting or migrating a like button. So they created a component, a React component for the like button, and it worked, or the status update, and it can live inside of a different page until slowly, piece by piece, they started slowly repasting it over time until eventually they just had a whole React site in general, and removed it from PHP and migrated it. So it's very interesting, actually. And to do that, you cannot necessarily do that with Angular. It's difficult to do that because you have to mount it, and it's not meant for that. Angular is a framework that is meant for single page applications. It doesn't blend that well or play nicely with different technologies all within the same kind of page and site. Testability. One thing to note is that it's testing on the front end is hard, right? With Angular and Protractor and those things. But because React is component based, and it's at the end of the day, it's just JavaScript functions, right? If you get into it that much, and there's classes as well, but functions, small units of code. So you have something called Jeff's library, and there's other things called Enzyme, and now we have a React testing library. So you don't need to have a browser required. You can test your functions directly. You can do such things as asserting against the function, mocking data against the return, right? Doing some kind of mocking. You can also do some really cool stuff like snapshots. Like, you expect this component to return this HTML, or this length, or this this type of return. You can take a snapshot of that HTML and then do a test against it. It's really great. You can also use some shallow rendering on the DOM, and it gets really neat. Very interesting kind of testing first, around automated testing. So that's one of the main features of it, because the components are so simple, you can test them very well. So library versus framework, because we talk so much about a library versus framework, that we just wanted to quickly talk about that. So when we're talking about library and framework, that was one of the main things to note. So Angular is a framework that contains all the building blocks needed. So it makes all the decisions for you. And I come from the Visual Studio kind of Microsoft background. I like this. I did like it, and I was very pro for this, right? So in the Angular framework, you have a testing suite in there called Protractor. You have an Angular router for page navigation and transitions. You have an HTTP client built in. The Angular HTTP module to take requests is all built in. All that stuff is built in for you. You don't have to worry about this stuff. With React, it's a library and it's lean, so you have to make those decisions, right? So the framework, Angular has opinions, and you don't need to So one of the pros is you don't have to make any, you don't have to worry about it. All the decisions are made to you. There's no fatigue, less overhead setup. It enforces consistency with their versioning, right? Whereas React is very small. It's meant to do what it does to do UI components. So it's very it's very clean and concise, and it doesn't force any decisions on you. It allows you to pull in only what you need when you need it, right? So you might have an application that's just read only and you have one page. You don't need to worry about a testing framework, or you don't need to worry about a router, or you don't need to worry about all this kind of stuff, state management. You just got what you need. And then when you need to change pages, you go, okay, I need to go and look for something that's going to help me transition. Why don't I pull in React Router? Only when you need it, though. So only what you need. So that's what I'm trying to get at. So React doesn't come, it's a component library, again, doesn't come bundled with anything. You pull in when you need it. So Angular comes with this: components, testing, HTTP library, routing, form validation, and the CLI built in. So the CLI is the command line interface, and it's all built in there by itself, right? So React comes with just components. That's it. That's all. If you want to do testing, you can choose between Jest and Mocha or Enzyme or whatnot. If you want to do HTTP requests, you can use Fetch. You can use Axios. It's up to you. React Router is the most popular one. Forms, there's Formic, React Forms. There's all these different ones out there. And the CLI, you have to install something called Create React App. So your choice. You don't need to install any of that. You can just use a library and just build components. It's up to you. That's what's great about it, and that's why it's so popular, I believe. So again, this decision fatigue, right? Because it's so lightweight and unopinionated. There are multiple ways of doing it, many options. So you need to kind of research, ask around. A lot of opinions on what's best. Depends who you talk to, depends what teams you're on. So it's a little bit intimidating because all the design decisions, right? There's 100 boiler, but there's 100 boilerplates out there. Create React app, create React native app. So they help you get started, to help you with the transpiling and bundling and all that stuff. And then there's a lot, these are not needed, but these are the important related libraries. Again, React Router is pretty tried and true for page navigation. We get into, and then there's Redux. Redux is state management. That's a whole other thing in itself. That's for big applications. You probably might not need it for a small. In fact, it's probably overkill for a small application. But when you get into bigger ones, you might want to do reducers and all these things. But again, you don't need to do that. You could do that. It's up to you. Again, it's your own. It's your own preference and development. Continuing on that, right? Okay, continuing. So I talked about types. So in Angular, it's TypeScript, and it's very strongly typed, right? So with Angular, it is JavaScript, but you have the option, again, opinion, if you want to use that kind of strongly typed kind of C# uh, typed language. You could pull in some things called, you could pull in TypeScript and Flow and these kind of things for static checking. There is something though in React called prop types, so you can actually check. You can do your own checking if you don't want to pull it in, these things in. State management. Okay, so state management, this is one of the things that gets with React, how to manage state. You always end up at this point, right? So plain React with context API and hooks, it's pretty good solution, very good. Then when you get into these other kind of centralized, bigger libraries, then you have to decide, what you're going to use. This is where it gets complicated, right? They have Flux, Redux, Mobex. Never heard about that. They're all their own beasts. It's a more advanced topic, to be honest, and it's kind of going outside the scope of this intro. Styling, there's 100 ways to style it. Use what you know. Features, again, we're given this list. We're basically showing, what Angular comes with and what React comes with. Very little, and it's up to you to pull it all in. And the last slide here, we'll just basically wrap it up. So the main points here for a Hello React app. So all you need, you run create React app, it'll go scaffold everything out for you. And all you need to do for a working React app is a DOM container with an empty div tag to mark the spot where you want to display something. So what that's trying to say is you need an empty tag here. This is very basic, right? It's just saying this is the tag you're going to say hello world in, and this is what it meant. This root tag in your page, that's where the whole application is going to be inserted into it. You have this script here, and this is a tiny one. It just says render all of this. This could be your component. It's just a piece of JSX right now. It could be a component that could have children component that could have your whole application in it, or it could be very simple like this. And this render is going to take that, whatever that is, and it's going to say grab this element by ID and just basically mount it all inside of that root tag, and that's it. That's how it renders. So the React render function renders that HTML header right into this div root element, and all the heavy work is done by React.js, React DOM, and Babel.js, and that's all you really need to know. That you can basically, that's all you need to know. You create your React app, and this will basically mount it for you, and it's really flexible. It's really nice. And so this was basically just an intro to React. We're of course going to get into a lot more detailed, a lot more complex topics. Not really complex, but just getting into all of the main fundamentals we talked about today. So we're going to start looking at the virtual DOM next, and then what components are, and component state, and all these nice things. And we're going to build some really nice apps with this. So, and that's it. All right. Thank you very much. We're going to just end on that note, and I'll see you when I see you. All right.